I personally, just coming back after 2 years being away on myself retired, there's a Harry Chapin song. Some of you may know it. It's called the Circle Song. And the opening lyrics are, "All my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The world is going round again. What is lost is found." And I certainly feel that all my life's a circle, having the privilege of being back with you all today. It was in 1974 when I first met Nancy Schlossberg. I was 29, and it was my first tenure track position at the University of Maryland. She was an enormous mentor of mine, and we used to argue all the time because she, of course, a TC graduate, and knew Esther Lloyd Jones and worked with her personally, and Esther Lloyd Jones made the claim that student development and student affairs, student personnel began here. And I was a University of Minnesota graduate, where E.G. Williamson made the same claim. Despite that rivalry, she took me under her wing and mentored me through the tenure process and in so many other ways. So you can imagine what a joy it is to be able to be back here. And Victoria Marsick and I have been colleagues since 1990. And we took chairs being chair of the department, as it was variously called, adult learning, adult and higher education and adult learning, whatever learning. And we may not have been experts in transition theory because of Nancy, but we certainly were by name change. You all have seen the bio, and there aren't enough pages to fill the bio. But I'd like to introduce Nancy to you by saying I think that there are 4 characteristics that she has brought to all her work, and it's one of the reasons why the work is so lasting in the deepest possible way. One is Nancy has always brought the joy to her life. She's taken joy in her life and in the people around her. Her family, especially her beloved Steve and Mark, her son, who is with us today, and her daughter Karen. She took joy in her colleagues, and she took extraordinary joy in her students. You got to be a better teacher just by listening to Nancy talk about her last class. The second characteristic that she brought to us was an unfailing optimism and belief in our capacity as individuals to grow, to develop, and to learn. It was a fundamental notion that life was about enhancement and generativity and not about deficits. I know that's something that she has passed on to her own dear children. So she had this unfailing optimism in what Kurt Lewin called the P of the P&E equation, the person in the context of the environment. But the third characteristic that Nancy brought to us and brings to you, and this was particularly important for me as a young scholar, was her emphasis on the environment in the person-environment equation. Nancy has always had a justice-oriented belief in our moral and ethical responsibility to shape environments to make them better for more people in more ways. And that goes with the fourth characteristic that I think Nancy possesses, and that is a profound and nuanced attention to the process. Nobody listens to you better than Nancy. Sometimes when she reflects what you've said, it's scary, but nobody listens better than Nancy. That profound ability to combine an optimism about people and a moral responsibility to shape more effective environments led her to develop 2 major models. I see them as process models in our field. They are among the most cited in the student development and adult development literature. The first you're going to hear a lot about today, her model of transitions. And that has been a model that has been used and adapted in so many different areas, and Victoria and I hope to be able to speak about that. But a second model is her model of marginality and mattering, her firm belief that environments should be shaped to give people the message that they matter, that they can grow, and they can learn. and not be marginalized in the higher education community or indeed in any other community. And that has led to a profound area of all separate research in shaping higher education, college and university environments around issues of gender and race and age and international student status and first generation that I believe never would have had the kickstart if it hadn't been for Nancy. And lastly, she has always in her life found ways to challenge us to be better and to learn more, and found ways to support us in that effort. And I look forward to her new book. Can't believe that she calls herself retired. To her new book, which will be published by the American Psychological Association, Too Young to Be Old. And let me just introduce you to somebody who some people would say is too good to be true, and I'm saying she's the best there is.
I think it's time for me to leave. Okay, I want to very quickly, sort of give you a little background about the transition theory. I think it's interesting, as I look back, my first study was after I got my degree and found my dissertation. After that, my first study was of adult men, 35 and over, who were undergraduates at Wayne State University. My question, in my mind, was, can adults change? And here was a group of men, blue-collar workers, committed to having to pay mortgages this is back in the 60s, traditional marriages. So I wanted to learn about them. I keep turning because it's a funny angle. So I wrote a letter. I was a very beginning researcher, and there were no computers, and there were 650 men. Dear Mr. Jones, I have become fascinated with men like you. Well, then I gave a little questionnaire. I started getting phone calls. We want to meet you. Nobody's ever taken this kind of interest in me before. So I had a file of 650 men who thought I was wonderful. It kept my husband in line every time and so we had a pretty happy marriage. Now, I've wanted to get funding to sort of update that sample, but I haven't. Anyway, that's interesting. That's my first study. Now what am I studying? Well, I did a magazine article recently on senior romance. Now, isn't that interesting? Here, I've gone from the 35 and overs to now seniors. And I called Match.com to see, were they getting more requests from older people? And they referred me to a video of a 90-year-old woman who enrolled in Match.com, met an 85-year-old man, and they got married. And Match.com paid for the wedding. And in the video about them, the man says, it was all about Scotch and Shakespeare. We love both. So the point is, it's not over till it's over. And I think Dr. Ruth here could give some insight into that. But there's a lot of romance going on. And I'm interested, now that I had this epiphany one night, I really did. I had an epiphany. I woke up, you're old, I thought. Demographically, you're old. Well, that was really a shock to me, but it's true. So I've sort of gotten more involved with aging because I am aging. And the new book, Too Young to Be Old, is really about transition theory as applied to older people. And so there is a chapter in the book on romance. It's called Romance If You Want It. because, as a lot of women have said, they're not interested. One woman said to me, "My husband died. I am not interested in pots or pans or prostate glands." So you can see, you can see the evolution of my thinking now. But I think enough of this. I'm really to share with you some key points. What I'm about lately, I've started using the metaphor of the kaleidoscope. Because when we talk about transitions, they become very linear. And you know, you can change the kaleidoscope. I don't think I have enough, but I have like a card, and here's the kaleidoscope. Because as you turn the kaleidoscope, your perspective changes. And so I like to think of transitions in flux. But I also like to think of myself as dissecting transitions. And I want to share some of those with you. These are the things that make a difference. After all, everyone in this room is probably having 5 or 6 transitions at the same time. And some you're handling well, and some you're kind of bungling up. And sometimes you do well with the transition, sometimes you don't. So what are the factors that make a difference? Well, key is the definition. A transition is an event, you get promoted, or a non-event, you do not get promoted. And by the way, my research on non-events, I think, is probably my most interesting because there's so little written about non-events. But it's an event or non-event that alters your life, your roles, relationships, routines, and assumptions. So here you've got a transition, and those, if it's a big one, everything is changed. And then you've got this middle period of struggling to find what they say, get a life, where you develop a new way of being in the world. And so that's kind of the transition process. But the key is, well, let me go back. Why are happy transitions sometimes unsettling? Because they change your roles, relationships, routines, and assumptions. And it's for a moment discombobulating. Okay, so I'm dissecting transitions in 15 minutes. One is the degree to which it changes your life. Second, and really important, timing. There are 4 things to look at. Is this transition of yours on time, off time, out of time, or no time? If it's on time, it's something you want. It's something you expect. So therefore, it's working out. You don't give it a whole lot of thought. But what about the off-time transitions? The ones you have to move home with your parents because you can't afford to live on your own. That's off time after college. Or many things that are off time, they're not what you expected. They're the detours in your life. So you've got the on time, the off time, the out of time. I don't know whether you study Gunhild Hagestad. She's a brilliant sociologist, and she's written a lot about family transitions. She wrote a paper about out of time. She was ill for almost a year. She was not connected to television, to radio, to newspapers. She was like suspended in time. And I think many of us have had experiences, not just with illness, but where you're just not connected to time for a moment. You're out of time. And then what I call no time, that is the non-event. There's no time. It hasn't happened. And let me say a word about non-events. I think there's a chapter in the textbook, and I had a book, but it's out of print, and it called Going to Plan B. the non-event was so interesting because nobody has written about it really. What kind of non-events and how do they change your life and how do you cope with them? You have a book party for the book that's published. You do not have a book party for the book that didn't get a publisher. And who celebrates your non-events? Who knows about your big disappointments? I tried it out at a cocktail party one night. I said to somebody, would you like to hear about the things that aren't happening in my life? I want to tell you, he slithered away. He was not interested. So it's not great to talk about your non-event, but it's really fascinating to see how do we deal with non-events. But there's not time to go into that, but the important thing is, okay, we've now looked at transitions, the degree to which they change your life, then we've looked at timing in your life, and then the process, the transition process. I've been a widow, and I know that people think that they're nice to you and they take you out to dinner, maybe once, maybe twice, and then you should get over it. Well, you don't get over it right away. It takes some time. The same with a new job. You get promoted and you're required to use skills you've never used before. It takes a while to not feel like an imposter, to feel comfortable. So there's a time factor. But let's think, what are the factors that make a difference in how you do cope with transitions during this period of incorporating something, a new transition in your life? And that's where my 4 S's come in. Your resources for coping, your situation, self, supports, and strategies. And I should have brought today, because I haven't talked much about it, but there is something we developed called the Transition Coping Guide. Wait a minute.
Right here.
Oh. Well, that doesn't have the pretty cover.
But it's got my scores. You want me to share?
And this is a way to assess your 4 S's. Let me briefly just tell you about a study that Zandy Leibowitz and I did at NASA Space Flight Center. The University of Maryland had a contract with NASA, the Goddard Center. And during the time that we had this program, there was a reduction in force, and 55 men's jobs were eliminated. Now, they weren't looking at men. The computer fed things into the computer, and it turned out they were all men. And we studied them. Zandy and I interviewed them the week they were told, and 6 months later. And that's why it's very difficult to say much about a transition at one point in time, because how you feel today is not how you'll feel tomorrow. All but 2 people were devastated. They'd been kicked in the belly, hit in the back. I mean, it was worse, they said, than a diagnosis of cancer. 6 months later, they said, if I can handle this, I can handle anything. What happened during that period? And what was so interesting about the NASA program, NASA had assigned everybody whose job was eliminated to a buddy in the HR department. And that buddy stayed with them until the person got something to replace what the person had lost. So they came away feeling good. And from that study, I learned about the importance of institutional support, the environmental support. So again, this is the point I'm making, is when you look at transition, whether it's career, personal, whatever it is, today is not forever. If you're happy today, you'll be sad tomorrow. If you're sad today, you'll be happy tomorrow. I mean, it changes, it evolves over time. And then the 4th part is, of those 4 S's, as you're thinking about your transition and you're thinking about, is your situation good or bad? Are your supports better than your sabotagers? Supporters better than your sabotagers? How about yourself? Are you an optimist or a pessimist? And then we get to coping strategies. And I think a simple way to think about coping strategies is, I've used the work of Perlin a lot, also Lazarus and Folkman, but the Perlin work, he really categorized thousands of coping strategies, thousands, into 3 categories. Those coping strategies that you use when you're challenged that will help you change what is going on. Brainstorming, legal action, you're going to change. You didn't get tenure. You're going to change that. You might go back to school or you might fight it, whatever. Then there are those categories, those coping strategies that try to change the way you look at it. Reframing. We all have to do that a lot. And then there are the ones, whatever you're doing, that help you reduce your stress level. And that's what we hear about stress management. And then the 4th that I add is sometimes it's better to do nothing. We all want to take action quickly, but sometimes it's better to do nothing. So there are 4 questions. Can I change the situation? Can I change the way I look at it? Can I manage my stressful reactions, or should I just sit tight for a while? So if we think about any transition you're having, you want to understand the degree to which it changes your life, the timing of it in your life, where you are in the process, what are your resources for dealing with it. And I'll end with this, that really all through life, we're balancing things. We're balancing work and family, health and sickness. There's always something that's pulling us this direction, that direction. And I think the key to the transition, thinking about it in terms of transitions, is that it is not one factor alone that makes a difference. There are a lot of self-help books with one factor. Now, I had one once that I wanted to get thin. So it got a book and it said, if you image yourself in a bikini over and over, you'll get thin. I want to tell you, I have imaged myself in that bikini and I didn't get thin. And I wanted my money back. But it is really the balance of your resources to your deficits at any given point in time. And that will explain to you why sometimes you handle something very well and other times you're overwhelmed. So I wish you good luck in your balancing, and I don't want you to be overwhelmed. And so what I'm giving you, I told Lee earlier, who was a marvelous colleague and probably the best teacher we ever had at Maryland, and if not the best speaker I've ever heard, I think the best. But I said to Lee, the 2 tricks of teaching, one, always have a handout, and then stop before you're committed to stop. Stop early, and they'll think you're good. So I had a little card made up. Here's the kaleidoscope. And then it says on the back, as the kaleidoscope changes, so does your perspective. And I have a few transition reminders from today, and that just might give you some things to think about. So I thank you very much for honoring me today, for honoring my work, but I want to honor all of you who have been so interested, not just in transitions, but in trying to understand what makes people tick. Now, sorry, are you going to sit here?
No, you're going to stand.
Okay.
Pots, pans, and prostrate glands.
That's what you're Gotta remember, isn't it?
Now you know what my pre-tenure life was like. Probably the single most enjoyable time of my life, actually, in terms of that kind of mentoring. What Victoria and I have been asked to do, and will do in short order so that you can spend your time engaging with questions with Nancy, but is to give some examples, sort of pragmatic examples, asking you to think about how you could use this work in your own life, okay? And I think one of the critical reasons why Nancy Schlossberg work has endured in the way it has and has been as popular as it has been is that she has designed process models with a deep understanding of the human condition, a deep understanding of the interaction between the person and the environment, right, that are adaptable. Those 4 S's are adaptable. Situations change. The self of the people going through the transition changes. The kind of support system or sabotage system, it's almost 5 S's really, that exist at any time change, and certainly the strategies will differ depending on what you're doing. So it's been my pleasure to just talk about a couple of areas in which Nancy's work is adaptable, and to ask you to think about how you could adapt it, either personally or professionally. And the first example I'd like to give comes out of the world of intercultural communication and intercultural psychology, and that is for years, the focus on intercultural transitions was around describing culture shock models. And they were enormously descriptive of the kind of experience that people often have when they experience culture shock. Initially, those works were descriptive about what happens when you leave your quote-unquote home culture and go to a new culture. And then later, they became descriptive about what happens when you come home. Certainly, as an ex-Peace Corps volunteer, I remember that I got much more training about going abroad than I did coming home 3 years later and seeing that my sister was taller than I was, and although I hadn't aged, somehow my parents had. But but what I want to suggest was the work was powerful, but it was descriptive. It didn't help you think about, how do I make this better? You know this, Mary, from all your work. What Nancy's work, when we've combined it with the work in intercultural communication, has allowed us to do is have the ability to help people who are facing intercultural, international transitions, or just even intercultural transitions, they don't need to be international, to be more reflective about that transition, to be able to dissect it using Nancy's process model, and then to take more specific action, right? That we don't have to be stuck in description. We can actually move to proscription and to action that can lead to more successful transitions and certainly much less of what had been called the bad things in culture shock. Now, that's one example, but I challenge you to think about how would that work as you think about people who are transitioning into your workplace, people who are transitioning out, people who are transitioning roles. I remember the first time, by the way, speaking of role transition, when I moved from being a faculty member to being a dean, I lost IQ points over the weekend. And certainly, if you ask my colleagues, I did, just by taking the job. The second example is a TC example, right? And this is really taking Nancy's work seriously. In the program of social and organizational psychology, we have a very special master's program called the Eisenhower Leadership Development Program. And Warner Burke and I were part of the design of that, and Karen Block teaches in that, Deborah Newmare teaches in that, well, virtually all our faculty now teach in the program. It's a program that is designed for about 24 officers who have been in active combat and actively recognized as leaders They're captains and majors in the United States military. And they are going to come back and get a master's degree with us for 1 year and then serve for 2 or 3 years as the mentors for the entire cadet corps at West Point. Right. Now, I want you to think, these are, and we're in our 12th year, I believe, of the program now. These are 24 young men and women already proven in their leadership, many of whom by now have had 4 and 5 deployments abroad in the Middle East. So they're transitioning, coming back to, quote unquote, the United States, which is supposedly more peaceful. They are transitioning, coming back, in many cases, to their family, many of whom have spent more time on deployment than they've spent with their family. They are transitioning, coming back to a role change from being a military officer on assignment to being a graduate student. And they are transitioning in anticipation of becoming mentors to the Corps of Cadets. That's a lot of transition, and they are going to then take 9 months of coursework with us, and boom, be the new person, be the new job, have adjusted to the family, right? Deal with PTSD, all those kinds of things. Well, you know who helped us? Nancy Schlossberg. We began a program in which the students read her work. They read the theory of transition. Then they took a transition measure. Sorry about the unpretty cover.
I'll send you a new one.
Yeah, I had to pay for this one. I'll take the new one. Where you go through and you do the assessment of yourself on the S's and you do your own scoring, right? You're your own human being. And then they responded to feedback that they got on their own feedback on the measure, their own peer dialogues on it. They then took a questionnaire that we designed specifically called Transitions to TC, right, based on Nancy's work, and what we knew about who they were, right, the self, what the situation was, those 4 transitions they were making, and believed that they could create supports and they could create strategies. And one of the words that Nancy uses in her model is that you need a convoy. It takes a village, it takes a convoy. Well, they could get in it to It Takes a Convoy, believe me, very much. They then continued to use the transition model in their discussion groups, in their adult development classes with us, and in their leadership development classes with us, and it became part of the motif. And then they transitioned that knowledge about themselves and their families and their new roles to seeing the cadets as people in transition. Okay. Right. We could not have done that without Nancy Schlossberg's work. Okay. So I deeply, deeply encourage you to do your own 4S assessment, whether it's thinking about yourself in the workplace or thinking about yourself making your own transitions or thinking about the people with whom you're working. This is a powerful, practical, useful, but most importantly, developmentally enhancing model, right? And it can change programs, and it can change lives. And we could give you, all of us, I'm sure, who have studied her work, many more examples. But one of the great things about being able to use a model that is as adaptable as Nancy's is, and it's only adaptable because it's as deep and as well thought through and as well researched as it is that it gets to bring Nancy into all those classrooms while she's down in Florida.
Did you write, is that written up?
No, we just do it.
No, the one on the veteran? I mean, what?
Yeah, I've got the questionnaires and stuff.
But it's fascinating. I mean,
yourself.
Okay, let's give a clap for Lee. Yeah, thank you, please. So it truly is an honor to be on a panel with such distinguished panelists. And I must say that, Nancy, your work lives in our program, still lives. That book that I just asked you to autograph is the book that's used in our Langer, who teaches our How Adults Learn class, and other classes use that book. And I was just sitting in his class this last Monday night, and he was teaching a model. So a number of things that we're talking about in this room are alive and well. And it also has formed the basis for a lot of conceptual frameworks and dissertations. Those of you who are in doctoral work, it's really amazing framework for people to use. So thank you very, very much. And when I was thinking about your model and thinking about what I could contribute to this conversation, I thought about it from the point of view of something that is mentioned in the beginning of your book and that you've talked about also, and that has to do with this notion of complexity. And the notion that transitions often happen, as you say, we're often going through multiple of them. We may not even think about it as a transition. We're just going through a challenge that it may be the signal that it's the beginning of a new transition, but we don't actually frame it as a transition. And the challenge that a lot of our students these days seem to come up with all the time is that it's not like you can go through a transition and it's full stop. It's the transition as you're going through it is changing. And there's so many changes that are going on that you start down a certain road working with something, and before you know it, you don't know whether you should name it that transition or you should name it a different transition, or that challenge that you're working with or a different one. So it is this, the lens that we have been working with around learning in a number of places in our program of complexity. And many of you probably, the idea of complexity is not the same as complicated, because many things are complicated, but you can find your way through if you find the right path. But when you're dealing with complexity, there are these multiple interactive feedback loops, which just means to say that you set something in motion and that clashes with somebody else's motion. And for example, the people who have come back from the war and who have all these multiple things going on, their families are going through transitions, the environment outside of them is going through transition, and as everything is in transition, it's interacting with one another, so to speak. So how do you think about the learning that has to go into that kind of thing is where I was heading for it. And I don't know if I can figure out how to use this because technology is one of my transitions. So I thought I would share with you some perspectives about that. And I drew especially on work from my colleague Lyle York. Some of you know Lyle York's. And he has a class that he teaches on strategy as a learning process. And in strategy as a learning process, he has developed and introduced a model that I think helps us to think about what this might mean for the 4S model. And so I'm going to share with you a few thoughts, starting with this, the idea of just that we're in these circumstances that I know many people refer to as VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I think I heard that about 20 years ago. It's an Army term, I believe, initially, but it's being used all over the place. And so it's because everything is so uncertain that we fumble a little bit about who am I? If I'm thinking about the self, or if I'm thinking about the support I have, the strategies that I might use, things of that nature, it's complicated because everything is changing so fast, I'm not always sure. So there's that piece of it. And then so that the frameworks that are engaged under these conditions need to cope with that condition of unpredictability. So what does that look like, and how do we begin to think about that from a learning perspective? Because there are these multiple intersecting feedback loops, and that really does make a difference. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that framework and what Lyle has discovered as he works with students around this idea of generative learning. How does that help, what he talks about, help you learn through complexity? So as you're going, because things are changing all the time, you're having to learn and relearn as you're moving through those moments. What does this mean for your model? And Nancy, I love the little section in your book that talked about this idea of shift work. Because the environment is shifting, you are shifting, everything is shifting in complexity. And so what does shift work look like? And what does shift learning look like, if I might use the word of shift? I'll use the analogy of shift learning. So what does that have to look like if we're going to go through it? So Peter Vail talked about this as permanent white water, in the 1990s. And boy, was he right, we're running through it. But it's because everything is constantly changing and there's this turmoil in so many people's lives that things intersect, and we are feeling like we're in that permanent white water. And so this notion of complexity is a lens that talks about these multiple interacting feedback groups that run into one another. And so what do you do with that? And what Lyle talks about in particular in his class is that in part what you have to do is to reconceptualize your own interaction with that ambiguity. And it becomes really challenging because many of us don't like it. It's okay for you, but it's not okay for me to have to deal with ambiguity. So what do we do about that? He works with a woman by the name of Veliki Nicolaitis, who I've also done some work with, and they talk about this idea of learning through, which again talks about balancing your commitment to moving in certain directions. So if you're working through the forest model and you make a commitment to certain plans and certain objectives, they may get interrupted as soon as you start trying to put them into place. So thinking, because of complexity, you often can't really, there are often multiple possibilities and those that you haven't imagined. One of the tools that people frequently use to deal with complexity and ambiguity is this idea of scenario planning, which you may have run into. Many organizations use it. The South African government used it when they transitioned into their new state of being. And it's the whole idea that you have to consider, many different kinds of scenarios. And even then, you might not imagine the one that you happen to be dealing with at this moment. I know a young man, for example, who has moved from a very large, stable organization where it's pretty well resourced, and he works in e-learning, and he had some good ideas about what ought to happen, and he decided he wanted to have a job in a startup, get some startup experience. So he got a job in a startup, and the conditions under which he took that job changed in a week. He was hired for certain capabilities and skills, which he has, but now the market externally is changing and he's supposed to make money within X amount of time doing what it is that he's supposed to be doing around mentoring, which everybody knows we love, but not everybody is willing to pay for it. So there's a lot of interesting turmoil and changes that are going on around that kind of thing. So how do you deal with that? And that's what Lyle is trying to work with. Another way of thinking about it is this idea of liquid modernity. I love that concept and idea that Bauman uses, that things are fluid and changing all along in an ambiguous world. So what do we do about that? How do we learn our way through that? So Lyle created, in this work that he's doing in this class, he's been working with several ideas that I think speak to, as you said, Nancy, you kind of have to go under the surface. And there are all these assumptions we don't even know we have. And there are also, as both Nancy and Lee work with, these what we have learned through developmental work, that there are different kinds of mindsets or frameworks in your head that they kind of act as the big lens through which you see a lot of things. So if you yourself are viewing a situation that you're in, if you happen to be a person who values social, if I do something, I want Lee to approve of it. I want her respect. And I'm going to consider that very differently than if I'm moving in and I'm saying, I have a vision of what needs to happen, and come hell or high water, this is what we're going to do. So depending on what your lens is, you're going to look at it differently. So putting some of those things together and thinking about how one might work with the complexity of transitions and how you learn through that. So Lyle talks about this idea of generative learning, and he talks about it in terms of how that might guide kind of a strategic action, strategic mindset and strategic action as you move through it. And it does involve this deep critical reflection on what we think and what we experience. And he does use these questioning techniques. I do a lot of work with that too. I know we all do. My own work has been in the area of action learning, and that says that what you really should do is always lead with questions. And you need, as you said, a diverse group of people, because the questions that everybody around me who I usually talk with, I'm going to get the same questions from them. But if I go far afield and talk to people who are in a different discipline, a different area, a different kind of an organization, I'm going to get different kinds of questions, and it's going to open up thinking for me. So this approach to complexity would deal with a lot of deep questioning, provocative questions. And then it is important to kind of really dig in and look at that mindset that we're looking for. And I have some interesting, examples about that.
one of the statements that one of the people in Lyle's class said, well, what surprised me was that I could see that my preferred habit of mine was to work alone to come up with a right answer, a skill set that got me only so far in my career as an organizational consultant. My collaborative learning group offered me the greatest insight that my skills increase exponentially when I open myself to learning with and from others. Our dialogues helped me step back and pause while developing strategic insights that helped me reframe my challenge. So that, I guess, is the reframe bucket from that point of view. But the point is that looking at one's mindset helps you to think, well, am I somebody who really values mostly deep efficiency or effectiveness? And do I have to step outside of that in order to understand what I should do in this transition? Another example from this young man who has has thought through very well what ought to be done to have really good e-learning. And so he created a tool, for example. They do mentoring in that organization, and people need to know about how to do things as a leader in the organization. And one of the things that we all need to learn how to do is run meetings well. And in fact, even the people in his own organization said they needed to learn that. So he put a short tool together for people, kind of a well put together, because he valued giving people what the real good stuff is, based on what we really know about good meetings. And he found that if he shared it with people in his organization, they didn't even have time to read it. They wanted to run better meetings, but they didn't have time to read it. So he had to put aside his effectiveness, his kind of like the thing I really think I should do, and say, okay, they're not going to be able to listen to it, and if they can't, neither can our clients. And so what can I put together that they will value, but would normally make me feel awful to have to give them 3 things, the 3 things you need to know to run a good meeting. But that's what you have to do. And so he tried that, and lo and behold, people in his organization picked them up, and they started doing them. So the idea here is that if you have a mindset in certain ways and you're going through a transition, maybe you need to set it aside and think differently in order to be able to figure out what are better solutions and strategies that I should be doing. So these are some of the mindsets, and I'm not going to go through that at this moment. So Lyle, in fact, has this, I think I just screwed that up, okay. All right, that's the complicated diagram, and I don't think I'm going to try to explain that all to you right now, but it basically says, if you look at the top, that in order to do this kind of learning in complexity, that there are certain competencies we bring to the situation, and there are a mix of these different tools that we've gotten. For example, if we have in the framework of the 4S model in our mind, we might come to a transition with that, and then we have certain experiences around it that lead us to think about what that transition might mean in deeper ways. My experience would be different from your experience of it. Then we can add that to certain ways of learning around going through that transition. But what really kind of kickstarts it is to add these provocative questions from diverse perspectives, and you multiply that or mediate it by the capacity that you have based on your insight into the deeper underlying mindset that you're using to come to the situation with. So it is a bit complicated or complex, I'm not sure, but it is a model that really kind of tries to bring all those things together to bear on helping you to learn through these transitions when complexity is in play. So if you think about transitions, this is the notion that's in your book, Nancy, that in fact, if you take complexity and chaos, they call for shift work, which they define as all the activities involved for clients to reinvent themselves continually, because things are changing continually, to identify opportunities, recover from setbacks, and find meaningful work that matters to themselves and others, and to capitalize on those chance opportunities. So it is, in fact, kind of an ongoing redefinition and a way of recovering yourself in the middle of a transition to re-recover yourself and start all over again, if you would. Even though you haven't gotten to the end of it yet, you have to start all over again because the conditions have changed so much. So this means that there's an ongoing iterative process involved because of these interacting feedback loops, and we do have to prepare for these alternative possible futures because we don't really know what we're going to end up facing as we go along the way. One other thing then to think about is, so what does it mean for shift learning? And just to kind of recap, the way in which this process of kind of going a little deeper and looking at the assumptions underneath helps you. It does help you to understand how we reframe and limit our understanding of the situation. It helps us process our feelings and what we see and hear and attend to. So oftentimes we find in asking questions that questions end up being maybe only the factual questions, and we don't unlock the feelings that people are having in the moment. Part of that is because those are often the elephant in the room. We may not want to see them ourselves. But when we get in touch with our feelings, then we really understand the kinds of questions that we need to hear and have. And so reflective questions that help us to go deep in that sense in the learning process is really helpful. And then, of course, questions that help us to unlock meaning and how we choose to act. So then finally, the learning then needed for these conditions, under these VUCA conditions, it needs to be collaborative. I think that's one of the things that's a bit challenging in transitions because we feel so vulnerable when we're going through something. To even say to people, you know, I'm not on top of my game, you know, is tough. It's very hard thing to do. So how, in fact, can we get a collaborative environment where we can work with our helpers that we have in the situation to really kind of dig deep and go ask those questions and think anew about the situation at hand. So this collaborative work in Lyle's class is very helpful because people say, well, you know, up until now I've been asking people about this and they've been asking me questions, but I haven't gotten the same insight because they're all thinking from the same way as I am. And then I go into class and I'm an adult learning student and this org psych student asks me this question from some completely different place, and it opens up my thinking completely. So we need to be able to keep inviting that differentness into our conversations. And then a lot of deep self-reflection and dialogue is needed. Dialogue's a funny word. It can mean an empty word in some ways because it's sort of like talking with people, but when we have dialogue, we're not only word to word, but we're also heart to heart. And so how do we really get that kind of deep communication? And then I do a lot of work, as I said, with action learning, and so I think the other thing is to be constantly being able to be in the middle of the situation and to be also in dialogue with the consequences of what you do. To me, one of the strangest things in our society is that we all say that the key to learning is feedback, and we all hate feedback, right? We're doing an action learning project right now with Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia through my action learning class. And this is to look at the residency training, the residency development, and also faculty development. And the biggest bugaboo is feedback. The residents don't feel they're getting feedback, and how are they going to learn how to be good doctors without getting feedback? We are not talking about, you know, psychological, deep, undercover problems. We're talking about feedback on the process that they just did, you know, in the operating theater or whatever. And the faculty hate it too. And one of the faculty members said, you know, what feedback really means is somebody's going to be critical of you. So we're really a funny culture, aren't we? We say feedback's important. We have tons of books about how to give feedback and even receive it, but yet we seem shy of it. So how are we going to put that on the table? And I think when we work with people in action on things in the moment, the feedback often comes from the consequences that happen. And so, you know, factoring into the conversation the feedback of doing the action and seeing what the consequences are. Maybe we have to have a friend with us sometimes when we look at those consequences. So, and finally, situated in really a deep understanding of the context of that situation. So I think I'll close there. I really appreciate. I know I was a little on the esoteric side here, but I hope I could add to the conversation by the work that we've been doing in our program around this notion of complexity and how it helps us to think about the kind of learning that really has to happen and the challenges around helping that learning to happen in transition. So.
Very proud of us. We said we'd leave time for questions, and we did. So I'm just traffic cop, and would like to know what kinds of questions you have. If When you ask the question, if you could stand so we can all hear you, please, back here.
I'm not familiar with organizational psychology, when you talk about the 4 S's, what do you mean by sabotage systems?
I'll give you a specific example in my research. There was an adult learner who was returning to school, and her mother agreed. Her mother they lived together. Her mother was elderly, and each week on the day of class, the medicine would fall in the toilet. Something would happen. Now, if you had asked her straight on, is your mother supportive of your going back to school? The answer is yes. If you begin to ask, in what ways is your mother supportive? In what ways could it be more supportive? You begin to find out there's this sort of balance between support and sabotage. I also, this is in the old days, had a lot of students who were returning to school, women, whose husbands were very supportive until they got home and the husbands did the white glove test. Now, that has changed, of course. The role of women has changed so much. But that's what I mean. You don't just, who is supportive? Everybody, your faculty member is very supportive. But what are the ways in which they could be more supportive?
And the second part,
Please.
I just finish the second part of my question, please. What about people who self-sabotage themselves?
Well, that's a whole other issue. We need the therapist for that.
If you think about the Nancy's model, 4 S's, 5 S's, I sometimes think that you worked for Sesame Street in your off time. Anyway, this model is brought to you by the letter S. Come on. The substitute the person going through transition for an institution or an organization or a department going through transition. And one of the biggest issues that Nancy has written about is the issue of marginality and mattering. And if you begin to think about institutions and you do honest feedback, one of the things that every higher education institution in this country will say is that we extol diversity. And we do these things to support its inclusion. And probably need to look at the things that they do consciously or subconsciously to sabotage the inclusion or success. And so that notion of thinking about, support is one thing, but sabotage is there. It could be some self-sabotage, but I'm much more interested in the sort of the institutional sabotage or the structural sabotage. There's a very wonderful article in Social Organizational Psychology called On the Folly of Expecting A but Rewarding B. And it's all about things that we set up to sabotage the very people we say we were inviting and things like that. Other questions, please?
If not, I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. Lee mentioned in her talk something that I had not mentioned. She talked about her return from the Peace Corps. And that led me, in my work, to become fascinated with role exit theory. That is, this transition process. When you leave something, either a marriage, a relationship, employment, you retire, whatever it is, you had a lot more focused on orienting you to the situation. Then when you're leaving, there's very little support. And that's what Lee was saying with the Peace Corps. There's very little. There'd be a workshop. And the same with retirement organizations. They'll give you a party sometimes, but that's hollow. It can be hollow. I mean, it's nice, but it can be hollow. But the question is, really, what are the psychological factors that go into it? And I believe you have a faculty member whose work is brilliant on this. I can't remember her name, and she might not have a TC. Lightfoot or Light?
Sarah.
Yes.
Sarah.
Okay. She here? Well, same thing. It's really a wonderful book that she has on the topic. She describes her own experience leaving a relationship. Now, I used to have students read another book on role exit theory, but to me it's a fascinating thing to think about, because we're all going into new situations and relationships, we're also leaving. Please.
As you were just describing that, I wanted to ask, is there anything around, it felt like there were a lot of parallels to addiction. So a recovering alcoholic who goes through a transition and then has to readjust. Is there any parallel research that's done, or is that like a similar?
I don't know. I don't know much about addiction. I do know that I was invited to come to be a speaker at a conference on cluttering. And so I said, when they asked me, well, I don't know anything about cluttering. I mean, I happen to know some clutterers, but they were talking about transition. And, you know, I went out there, it was absolutely fascinating. Some of these horrendous stories. One, a man was in a wheelchair and couldn't get from the bedroom to the kitchen because there was so much clutter. So they were working on the whole issue of transition, but I really don't know the addiction field at all.
Yes, yellow, orange jacket.
Yeah, orange. It's supposed to be good for my eyes. First of all, Nancy, I want to thank you for addressing this as a man. I like that when you said men. I don't want to be some politically correct person, so that was really nice to you. Okay. But my serious question relates to the idea that we're taking events or non-events or on time, off time, and we're compartmentalizing. And in one sense, when we have an event, we have a social acceptance of the probability of success. In the non-event, we don't have that probability, and we're left to our own devices. And so we inherently tend to run toward a negativity of the probability. We will lower the probability in the non-event environment. And I'm curious if you have thought about the idea that these events don't occur as binomial things, but can occur as things on some continuity or continuum. So that as the individual, I'm acting within a continuum, but not in this discrete set of events.
Well, I like what you said.
Thank you.
That's because you're a man. I think whenever we put things in boxes, which I do when I talk about a theory, when we put things in little boxes, it doesn't work. That's why I'm beginning to think of the kaleidoscope, why I'm beginning to think of movement. And I haven't, just recently that I've started thinking about the kaleidoscope and the fact that when we label things and put them in boxes, this is a non-event. Because take a non-event, every event maybe has some non-events attached to it. So I think what we're saying with your complexity theory, the things Lee said, what I'm saying is it's much more fluid than but when you write, you have to write in a linear way.
Yeah, it sort of feels like the Gilda Radner thing. It's always something, you know, there's one damn transition after another. It's just coming down the pipe. We have time for one more.
I have another question. Do I get a chance? This question is for Dr. Marsick. In presenting your model, the concern that I would have with Lyle's model is that when we talk about the collaborative event or the collaborative involvement, the goal is to get outside of our own framework. But I would argue that the lack of diversity within the collaboration basically fails that objective.
Well, he would too.
Because we end up reinforcing our similar frameworks, even though we have separate events hanging on those things.
No, I absolutely agree, and if I conveyed the idea that it would to be similar, you know, that's not actually true. He puts people in groups, or people choose to work in groups where there's a lot of diversity in groups, and the work in action learning is similar, is that the notion that you can't it's very hard to get provocative questions unless you come from totally different frameworks. So, and then of course you have to have all those other good things like psychological safety and bonding and all the rest of it, because we can have diverse people in a group and nobody says anything. And we've all been in those situations also. So how do you then help people not only have the skills but the safety and the trust to be able to raise questions that might be startling to somebody else is very important. You're absolutely right. You have to have the diversity in order to have the
I can go home now, I've gotten 2 hours. Tell my wife this. Do it.
One quick one, please.
Yeah, this may be for next year, if you want to come back, but what if, you know, they don't tell you when you retire, and I've been retired for 2 years, then it's another stupid full-time job. And you think that you can rest, and everything's in place, you've worked all this time for your retirement and all of that, and it gets overcomplicated so quickly. I'm lucky I'm not in cancer treatment now. That, you know what I mean? That's not, luckily I was working when that happened. So my next question is, and actually it has to do with clutter. And I will try your 4 S's on clutter and let you know how that goes. Because it's it's indicative of something, of holding on to something, I don't know. But my question really is, how do you get unparalyzed? Which S do you choose to get unparalyzed and move forward
Well,
towards
I
something?
don't mean to sound too self-serving, but I would recommend actually my book on retirement. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the only thing I could think of. I think the second book, and there's no easy answer to any of these questions, and they're all good questions, and I thank you very, very much.